The afternoon sun hung low over Portland, casting long shadows across the empty suburban street where Sarah Mitchell had lived peacefully for 8 years. She was driving home from Lincoln Elementary School, where she'd spent the entire day teaching fourth graders about American history and civic responsibility. It had been a good day. Her students had shown genuine enthusiasm during the lesson on the Constitution, and one particularly quiet girl had finally raised her hand to ask a thoughtful question. Sarah felt that familiar satisfaction that came with knowing she'd made a small difference in young lives. Her Civic, a modest silver sedan she'd purchased used 5 years ago, hummed quietly as she navigated the familiar streets toward her apartment in the Northwest District. Sarah Mitchell was the kind of woman who never made headlines. At 34 years old, she lived a deliberately quiet life built on principles and routine. She'd grown up in a small town in upstate New York, where her parents still ran a family bookstore. Her mother was a retired librarian, and her father had been a high school history teacher before his stroke 5 years ago. Sarah had followed in his footsteps, though she'd chosen to teach younger children, believing that shaping young minds during their formative years was the most important work anyone could do. She'd never been in serious trouble, never received a traffic ticket, never been to a police station except for routine fingerprinting when she'd been hired by the school district. As she turned onto Maple Street, Sarah noticed the flashing red and blue lights behind her in her mirror. Her heart skipped. She quickly reviewed her recent driving. Had she been speeding? She didn't think so. She'd been careful, conscientious as always. She pulled over smoothly, her hands already trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. The police cruiser pulled in behind her, and a tall officer with a stern face and sharp eyes emerged. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleamed in the fading sunlight, and his hand rested instinctively near his belt as he approached her window. Sarah rolled it down, her mouth suddenly dry. "License and registration," the officer commanded, not offering any explanation for the stop. His name tag read. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the glove compartment. She could feel his eyes studying her, assessing her. This was strange. She had done nothing wrong. Her registration was current, her insurance active, her license clean. She handed over the documents with a nervous smile, hopping to ease the tension that now filled her small car. Officer studied the documents with deliberate slowness. Sarah noticed his nostrils flare slightly, and he leaned closer to the window. "Have you been smoking marijuana?" he asked suddenly, his tone accusatory. "No, officer," Sarah replied, bewildered. "I don't use drugs, I'm a teacher. "Step out of the vehicle," interrupted, his hand already moving to his gun belt, though he didn't draw his weapon. His entire demeanor had shifted from routine to suspicious in an instant. Sarah's hands trembled as she unbuckled her and stepped out onto the street. Her mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She'd done nothing. The officer's eyes had taken on a cold, predatory quality that frightened her more than any weapon could. He gestured for her to stand away from the vehicle, and she, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I'm going to search your vehicle," announced, not asked. "Do you consent?" Sarah wanted to say no. Some instinct told her to refuse, to demand a warrant to protect herself, but she was terrified. She was alone on a residential street with a police officer who seemed convinced she'd done something. What if she refused and he got angry? What if he arrested her just for refusing? In that moment of panic and fear, Sarah nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Officer opened her car door and began a systematic search. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, watching as he moved through her vehicle with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He rifled through her glove compartment, her center console, under her seats. The violation was profound. This was her personal space, her sanctuary, being invaded by a stranger with a badge and an air of authority that made her feel powerless. Minutes passed like hours. Sarah could see lights in nearby houses coming on as evening deepened. She wondered if her neighbors were watching. Would they see this? Would they assume she'd done something? The damage to her reputation was already beginning, she realized with horror. Then Officer's hand emerged from the glove compartment holding something small and plastic. A baggie. Sarah's blood went cold. In that baggie appeared to be marijuana, a small amount but unmistakable. "What is this?" asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew or thought he did. His eyes had the gleam of victory. "I don't know," Sarah gasped. "That's not mine, I've never seen that before." His expression didn't change. He'd clearly heard denials before. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, and Sarah felt reality shift into something nightmarish. This was happening. This was actually happening to her. He continued reading her Miranda rights as he placed the baggie in an evidence bag, as he handcuffed her with practiced efficiency, as he helped her into the back of his patrol car with a hand on her head. Sarah's world collapsed into a small, dark backseat. Through the metal cage that separated her from Officer, she could see her car receding as he drove her away. Her life, as she knew it, was over. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd never committed a crime. She'd lived carefully, responsibly, by the rules. And yet here she was, arrested, accused, her future suddenly uncertain and terrifying. At that moment, Sarah didn't know that this nightmare was part of something larger. She didn't know that Officer had done this to other innocent people. She didn't know that this moment would eventually expose systemic corruption, or that her fight for justice would change the lives of 14 other wrongly convicted people. She didn't know that her simple, truthful words spoken in a courtroom months later would cause a trained police dog to betray its handler. She knew nothing of the future. All she knew was that she was innocent, handcuffed in the back of a police car and completely alone. The perfect storm of injustice had begun to gather, and Sarah Mitchell was about to face the fight of her life. She had no idea that everything, her career, her reputation, her freedom, would hang in the balance. But deep in her heart, past the fear and shock and despair, Sarah held on to one truth: she was innocent, and somehow she had to make the world believe it. The police car pulled away into the Portland evening, and Sarah's old life disappeared behind her forever. The holding cell was cold and gray, with walls that seemed to close in on Sarah with every passing minute. She sat on a metal bench, her hands still trembling hours after her arrest. Her phone had been taken from her immediately, placed in an evidence bag like she was a criminal. The irony was devastating. She'd never felt more helpless, more stripped of her identity and dignity. Around her, the sounds of the precinct continued, officers talking, phones ringing, the heavy electronic buzz of doors locking and unlocking. Sarah had always considered herself brave, but this was a different kind of fear. This was the fear of a system she'd never questioned, now turned against her. By the time she was released on bail the next morning, money her parents wired frantically from New York, the local news had already picked up the story. Sarah sat in her apartment that evening, trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The headline read, "Local teacher arrested on drug possession charges." There was her right there on the screen. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide with shock and terror. She looked guilty. That was the horrifying truth. The photograph made her look exactly like what the headlines suggested she was. People she'd never met were already forming opinions. People she'd taught with for 8 years were already making judgments. The internet was merciless. Her phone began to ring almost immediately. Her mother's voice was panicked, her father's in the background, asking questions. Sarah tried to explain, but the words felt inadequate. How could she make them understand when she didn't understand it herself? A drug that wasn't hers had been found in her car. There was physical evidence. The officer had discovered it. What defense did she even have? "Don't say anything to anyone," her mother instructed, her librarian's practicality kicking in. "Don't post on social media. Don't comment, just stay quiet." But silence was impossible. By noon the next day, the school district had called. Principal Davis's voice was formal, distant, the warmth she'd always appreciated completely gone. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of your case," he said. Not suspended. Administrative leave. It sounded better, but it meant the same thing: she was radioactive. "Principal Davis, I promise you I'm innocent," Sarah pleaded. "There's been some kind of mistake." "We need to protect the school," he replied coolly. "And the students. Until this is resolved, it's best if you're not here. You'll be contacted when the situation changes." Sarah hung up the phone and sat in shocked silence. Her job, her career, everything she'd worked for since college, all the fulfilling moments with her students, the parent-teacher conferences where parents thanked her for making a difference, all of it was gone. She was 34 years old, and her professional life had been erased in less than 24 hours. The social media storm was relentless. Former colleagues she'd considered friends began distancing themselves. Parents from her school posted comments on the news articles. Some were sympathetic, but many were harsh. "How could the school hire a drug dealer?" one comment read. Another said, "I'm so glad my daughter doesn't have her as a teacher anymore." Sarah's hands shook as she read. These were people she'd worked with, people whose children she'd nurtured. The assumption of guilt was overwhelming. In the court of public opinion, she'd already been convicted. Her apartment, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She couldn't leave without fearing who she'd run into. The grocery store, which she'd visited 100 times, suddenly felt like an obstacle course of potential judgment. An elderly woman at the store recognized her from the news and actually walked away from her, moving to a different aisle as if Sarah's shame might be contagious. Sarah abandoned her shopping cart and left. When she finally met with her public defender, James, the situation became even bleaker. He was young, maybe mid-30s, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he was carrying too many cases. His office was cramped and cluttered, with files stacked on every surface. He reviewed her case file for 10 minutes, barely making eye contact with her. "The evidence is pretty straightforward," he said, his tone suggesting defeat before they'd even begun. "They found drugs in your vehicle. Your prints aren't on the baggie that works in your favor, but without any alternative explanation." He trailed off, shuffling through papers. "It was planted," Sarah said desperately. "Officer must have put it there. I don't know why, but—" "We can't prove that," James interrupted gently. "And frankly, juries don't usually believe that defense. It sounds like a standard excuse." He leaned back in his chair. "I'd recommend considering a plea deal. If the prosecutor offers one, it might be in your best interest to take it. Avoid the trial, get a lesser sentence." Sarah felt something break inside her. Her own lawyer was already conceding. He wasn't even fighting. "I'm innocent," she said firmly. "I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do." James sighed. "That's your choice. But understand, if we go to trial and lose, the judge could sentence you more harshly than if you'd taken a plea." "I don't care," Sarah whispered. "I didn't do it." That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, watching shadows move across the white expanse as the city outside continued its indifferent life. She'd done everything right. She'd followed the rules, lived honestly, contributed to society. She'd never even received a parking ticket. And none of it mattered. The system didn't care about her character or her innocence. It cared about evidence, about testimony, about what a police dog had allegedly discovered in her car. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Stay strong. We believe you. We know you're innocent." Sarah appreciated it, truly she did. But her parents' belief couldn't stop the whispers at the grocery store. It couldn't restore her job. It couldn't convince a jury or convince her own lawyer to fight for her. As she lay in the dark, Sarah realized something terrifying. Being innocent wasn't enough. She had to prove it. And with the evidence against her and the system stacked in the prosecution's favor, she had no idea how she would ever do that. The nightmare had only just begun. The perfect storm of her arrest was now generating torrential rain, each day bringing new consequences, new losses, new reasons to despair. Sarah had always believed in the justice system. She taught her students about due process and the presumption of innocence. But now, caught in the machinery of that very system, she was beginning to understand a terrible truth. The machinery didn't always work. Sometimes it crushed the innocent just as surely as it was supposed to protect them. She was alone, desperate and terrified. And somewhere deep in that fear and despair, Sarah held on to the only thing she had left, the absolute, unwavering knowledge of her own innocence. It was fragile, but it was real. And somehow it had to be enough. The courtroom was vast and imposing, with high ceilings that made Sarah feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the American flag stood in one corner while the Oregon state flag occupied the other. Everything about the space was designed to intimidate, to establish authority, to remind everyone present of the serious business of justice. Sarah sat at the defense table next to James, who was shuffling through papers with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was as unprepared as she felt. The gallery behind them was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a handful of her colleagues from the school district who'd come to witness her downfall. She could feel their eyes on the back of her neck. The trial had been scheduled for 3 weeks after her arrest. 3 weeks of waiting, of sleepless nights, of meticulously going through every detail of that traffic stop with James. He'd coached her on what to expect, how to answer questions, how to present herself to the jury. She'd worn her best navy blue dress, the one she typically saved for parent-teacher conferences, believing that appearing professional and respectable might somehow translate to her innocence in the jurors' minds. She'd been naive enough to think that her character might matter, that the obvious miscarriage of justice would be apparent to everyone in the room. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, had taken her seat at the bench. The jury of 12 had been selected after hours of questioning. They looked like ordinary people, a retired accountant, a nurse, a construction worker, a stay-at-home mother, a college student. But to Sarah, they looked like her executioners. Each one of them held her fate in their hands, and she had no idea what they were thinking as they looked at her. The prosecution began their case methodically. Assistant District Attorney Torres was a seasoned prosecutor in her early 50s with silver streaking through her dark hair and the confidence of someone who'd won many cases. She presented the facts with clinical precision: the broken taillight, the traffic stop, officers' observations, the search, the discovery of the baggie. It all sounded so straightforward, so clear-cut. Sarah could see the jurors nodding slightly as Torres laid out the narrative. Yes, drugs were found. Yes, they were in Sarah's vehicle. Yes, there was a police officer's sworn testimony that he'd discovered them. Then officer was called to testify. He entered the courtroom with the same military bearing Sarah remembered from the traffic stop. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, his face the picture of professional authority. Torres guided him through his testimony with practice questions that allowed him to tell his story without interruption, explained his years of experience with the police department, his training, his commitment to public safety. He was likable, confident, and completely believable. Then came the crucial part. Torres gestured toward the back of the courtroom. "Officer, could you please tell the court about your K-9 partner?" A handler brought Rex into the courtroom on a controlled leash. The German Shepherd was impressive, massive, muscular, with intelligent eyes and a sleek black and tan coat. Rex sat calmly at attention, perfectly trained and obviously dangerous if provoked. The jury's attention snapped toward the dog. There was something primal about the reaction. A police dog wasn't just evidence. It was a symbol of authority, of trained expertise, of something that operated on instinct rather than bias. His entire demeanor changed when he talked about Rex. His voice became warmer, more passionate. "Rex has been my partner for 7 years," he began. "He's one of the most highly trained narcotics detection dogs in the state. His accuracy rate is 98%. In his entire career, he's detected hundreds of drug stashes, and his alerts have led to seizures totaling over $15 million in controlled substances." The numbers hung in the air, impressive and intimidating. Torres continued, "Officer, could you describe what happened when Rex alerted on the defendant's vehicle?" "I was conducting a routine traffic stop," explained, "when I noticed signs of impairment. The driver seemed nervous and there was an unusual smell. That's when I decided to bring Rex over for a standard vehicle scan. Rex immediately alerted on the glove compartment, paused for effect. Rex doesn't alert unless there are drugs present. It's not something he does casually. He's trained to a very specific trigger. When Rex alerted, I knew exactly what I would find. Sarah felt her heart sinking. The jurors were mesmerized. This wasn't just a police officer giving testimony. This was an expert talking about science, about evidence, about a highly trained animal that couldn't lie or be mistaken. The narrative was overwhelming. Torres pressed on. Officer, in your professional opinion, would Rex alert on a vehicle without drugs present? No, said definitively. Not unless there was a residual odor, but even that would be rare with a dog of Rex's caliber. Dogs don't make mistakes about these things. Rex is trained to detect specific chemical signatures. When he alerts, it means those chemicals are present. The prosecution presented photographs of the baggie, evidence of the substance inside, lab reports confirming it was indeed marijuana. They presented chain-of-custody documents showing how the evidence had been handled. Everything was in order. Everything pointed to guilt. By the time Torres finished her direct examination, the case against Sarah seemed airtight. James approached the witness stand for cross-examination, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could poke holes in story. Maybe he could find inconsistencies. But as he began asking questions, Sarah's hope began to wane, had answers for everything. Yes, he'd followed proper procedures. Yes, he'd documented everything correctly. Yes, Rex was certified and regularly tested. Yes, his record was impeccable. Officer, you've never had a case overturned based on Rex's alert, James asked hopefully. Never, replied confidently. The judge allowed James to continue questioning, but it was clear that he was fighting an uphill battle. The jury was watching Rex, still sitting calmly in the courtroom, perfectly behaved, perfectly professional. The dog had become the prosecution's most powerful witness. How could a jury doubt an animal? Dogs didn't lie. Dogs didn't have agendas. Dogs operated on pure instinct and training. By the time James finished his cross-examination, the damage was done. Sarah could feel it in the courtroom's energy, see it in the jurors' faces. They'd already made up their minds. A police officer with an impeccable record and a highly trained dog had that drugs were in her vehicle. The physical evidence was there. The narrative was simple and compelling. As stepped down from the witness stand and left the courtroom, Sarah realized that this moment, this testimony about a dog's nearly perfect record, might be the moment that sealed her fate. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming, so backed by authority and evidence and the unquestionable nature of a trained animal, that she couldn't imagine how she would overcome it. She looked at James, hopping for reassurance, but he looked as defeated as she felt. The machine of justice had begun its inevitable motion, and Sarah Mitchell was caught directly in its path. The trial had been adjourned for the day, but James remained in his cramped downtown office long after the sun had set over Portland. His small law practice occupied a single floor of an aging building in the Pearl District, a space he'd rented when he'd opened his practice 5 years ago, fresh out of law school and idealistic about the justice system. Now, at 36, his idealism had been worn down by case after case of limited resources, overworked public defenders, and a system that seemed stacked against the poor and powerless. His office walls were covered with diplomas, a few photos from law school, and mostly filing cabinets and stacks of case files that faster than he could process them. James sat in his worn leather chair, a hand-me-down from his father's accounting business, staring at his computer screen. His eyes burned with fatigue. He'd been awake since 5 in the morning, had spent the entire day in court watching his client get systematically dismantled by the prosecution's testimony, and now he was running on his 4th cup of coffee in pure desperation. The trial was going badly, worse than badly. He'd never seen a jury look so convinced of guilt so early in a case. Officer had been credible and calm. The dog, Rex, had made an impression on everyone who saw him. Even James had felt the weight of that impression, An animal doesn't lie, doesn't have bias, doesn't have reasons to fabricate evidence. But something nagged at him. Something about the way it held Rex's leash. Something about the officer's bearing when he spoke about the dog's alert. It was the kind of subtle observation that might mean nothing, or might mean everything. James had learned early in his practice that justice often hung on these small details, the things that nobody else noticed because they were too focused on the big picture. He pulled up his email and scrolled through messages from weeks and months past. There, an email from his law school friend, who was now a criminology professor at Portland State University, had sent him an article months ago with the subject line, "Interesting research you might find useful someday." At the time, James had barely glanced at it. He'd been dealing with 3 other cases, and his inbox was overflowing. He'd mentally filed it away as interesting but not immediately relevant, and never returned to it. Now, with nothing to lose and everything to lose, James searched for that email. There it was. The article was titled "Handler Bias and K9 Reliability, a study on false positives in narcotics detection dogs." The publication was from a peer-reviewed criminology journal, the kind of academic source that wouldn't normally find its way into a trial. But James's hands began to shake as he read the abstract. The study examined over 200 cases involving police dogs trained to detect narcotics. It tracked the dogs' alert rates, the conviction rates that followed those alerts, and most crucially, the cases where contraband wasn't actually found despite the dog's alert. The findings were shocking. The study concluded that handler bias was a significant factor in false positives. Dogs, the research explained, were extraordinarily attuned to their handlers. They picked up on minute cues, a tightening of the leash, a change in breathing, a subtle shift in body language, even a handler's unconscious expectations telegraphed through pheromones and microexpressions. James felt his pulse accelerate. He clicked through page after page of the study, his exhaustion evaporating as adrenaline flooded his system. The research detailed case after case where dogs had alerted on innocent vehicles or innocent individuals because their handlers, consciously or unconsciously, had signaled expectations of finding drugs. In some instances documented in the study, handlers had even been caught on video, unaware they were being recorded, engaging in subtle behavioral cues that prompted their dogs to alert. One case study particularly captured his attention. A dog handler in California had a conviction rate of 95% based on K9 alerts over a 10-year period. The dog was considered exceptionally reliable. Then, following a complaint about possible evidence planting, the department's Internal Affairs Division had begun reviewing cases and questioning some of the dog's alerts. When they reviewed video footage of the handler during vehicle searches, they discovered that the handler was engaging in subtle signals, a quick nod, a barely perceptible tightening of the leash at specific moments, that corresponded to the dog's alerts. The handler wasn't consciously aware he was doing it, but the dog had learned to read these signals. When the handler suspected drugs might be present, he unconsciously signaled that to the dog, and the dog, conditioned to respond to these signals, would alert. In nearly 40% of the cases reviewed, no actual contraband was found despite the alert. The handler was eventually convicted of evidence planting. James read that passage 3 times, his mind racing. He pulled up another section of the study that discussed how dogs could misinterpret benign smells as drug odors. A dog that had learned to associate certain chemical signatures with narcotics might alert on residual odors, smells that had nothing to do with current drug presence. A dog might alert on a car where someone had previously transported drugs, even though no contraband was currently present. The science wasn't nearly as black and white as Officer had. He scrolled further and found a section discussing the admissibility of K9 evidence in court. Several jurisdictions had begun challenging the reliability of K9 alerts, and some courts had started requiring additional corroborating evidence before allowing a K9 alert to serve as probable cause for a search. The article documented cases where convictions had been overturned on appeal based on questions about K9 reliability. James leaned back in his chair, his mind working frantically. This was it. This was the crack he needed in the prosecution's seemingly impenetrable case. Officer had with absolute confidence that Rex had a 98% accuracy rate, that the dog never made false positives, that a dog's alert was essentially infallible. But that testimony, James now understood, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how dogs actually worked. Believed Rex was operating on pure instinct and training, but what if Rex was actually responding to his own unconscious bias? What if the handler was signaling his expectations to the dog? James pulled out his phone and called, not caring that it was nearly midnight. "It's James," he said when his friend answered, groggy and confused. "That article you sent me months ago about K9 handler bias, I need to talk to you about it urgently. I need your help as an expert witness." "Now?" asked, confusion evident in his voice. "My client is going to be convicted based on a police dog's alert," James explained rapidly. "But I think the dog was responding to handler bias, not actual drugs. I need someone who can explain that to a jury. Can you help?" There was a pause, then said, "Send me all the trial documents. I'll look at them tonight. If what you're saying is what I think you're saying, this could be huge." James spent the next 2 hours compiling documents, writing summaries, and sending everything to. By the time he finished, it was 2 in the morning, but for the first time since taking Sarah Mitchell's case, James felt a glimmer of genuine hope. It was fragile, desperate, and probably futile, but it was there. The next morning called him back. "I've reviewed everything," he said. "The behavior descriptions from the trial, the way he held the leash, his confidence level, his assumptions, they're consistent with a handler exhibiting confirmation bias. I think I can testify to that. But James, I have to warn you, this is going to be controversial. Most courts don't question K9 reliability, and the prosecution will come at me hard." "I know," James said, "but it's all we have, and it might be the truth." As James hung up the phone, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had discovered something that might save his client from a wrongful conviction, but getting a judge and jury to believe that a police officer and his dog might be engaged in unconscious bias would be an uphill battle. The system had too much invested in trusting the authority figures it had trained to enforce the law. But it was a chance, a thin, desperate chance. And sometimes that was all justice required. James stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, mentally preparing for what might be the most important motion he'd ever filed. His hands trembled slightly as he organized his papers, arranging them in the leather portfolio his father had given him when he'd passed the bar exam. That had been 5 years ago, when James had been full of idealism and the belief that the legal system was fundamentally fair. Now, standing on the precipice of a motion that would either be his salvation or his professional suicide, that idealism felt like a naive dream. The judge had granted him an emergency hearing to discuss new evidence. Judge Harrison had seemed intrigued by his vague explanation over the phone, but also skeptical. Emergency motions happened all the time in her courtroom, and most of them went nowhere. She'd agreed to hear him out, but her tone had made it clear that he'd better have something legitimate to present. Sat in the courtroom gallery, his briefcase beside him. The criminology professor had taken time off from his university obligations to be here. He'd reviewed the trial documents, watched the video recording of officers' testimony, and prepared detailed notes about handler bias and K9 reliability. His presence was reassuring, though James knew that even an expert witness couldn't guarantee a positive outcome. Sarah sat at the defense table, her eyes red from a sleepless night. James had warned her not to get her hopes up, but he could see it in her face, a fragile glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, something could change. He'd explained the research to her, told her about and outlined what he wanted to do. She'd listened intently, and then she'd asked a simple question. "Do you think it will work?" I don't know, he'd answered honestly. It's never been tried this way before in a case like this, but it's our best chance. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with her usual efficiency, her black robe settling around her as she took her seat. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a judge for 15 years and had a reputation for being intellectually rigorous and fair-minded, though she also had a reputation for being skeptical of defense arguments, particularly those that seemed designed to muddy clear evidence. Mr. Judge Harrison began, gesturing for him to approach the bench. I've read your motion. You're asking for a very unusual accommodation. Before we proceed, I want to understand exactly what you're proposing and what basis you have for believing this will be relevant to the jury's deliberations. James took a deep breath and began. Your Honor, I've discovered research from peer-reviewed criminology journals that suggests police dogs, while highly trained, are susceptible to handler bias. The handlers unconsciously signal their expectations to the dogs through subtle behavioral cues, which can result in false positives, alerts on vehicles that don't actually contain contraband. That's an interesting theory, Mr. Judge Harrison said, her tone neutral. But we have an officer who that Rex has a 98% accuracy rate. We have evidence. We have a confession. Sarah didn't confess, James corrected carefully. She consented to a search and then maintained her innocence. But Your Honor, the point is that the 98% accuracy rate might itself be misleading. If officer is unconsciously signaling to Rex, then the dog's high accuracy rate doesn't reflect actual drug presence. It reflects the officer's expectations being fulfilled. Torres, the prosecutor, stood up immediately. Your Honor, this is speculation. There's no evidence that officer has engaged in any improper conduct. His record is impeccable. And frankly, this kind of attack on the reliability of police dogs is dangerous to public safety and undermines law enforcement's ability to do their jobs. Your Honor, I'm not attacking law enforcement, James replied calmly, though his heart was pounding. I'm asking for the opportunity to test a hypothesis. That's all a scientific demonstration would do. It would test whether Rex responds to handler cues or to actual drug presence. Judge Harrison leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled together as she considered the motion. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Finally, she spoke. Mister, what exactly are you proposing? I'd like to request that officer and Rex appear in court for a demonstration, James said carefully. We would have Rex encounter the defendant in a controlled setting, without officer signaling any expectations. We would observe the dog's behavior and see whether Rex alerts in the absence of actual drugs. Torres shot to her feet again. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's theatrical. It's designed to confuse the jury. Is it? Judge Harrison asked, fixing Torres with a steady gaze. Or is it designed to test the reliability of evidence that's central to the prosecution's case? Mister, your motion is unusual, but I'm inclined to allow it on one condition. You must present expert testimony from a qualified dog behaviorist who can explain the significance of whatever we observe. I have a criminology professor who specializes in police dog behavior, James said immediately. He can provide expert testimony. Torres objected strenuously, arguing that this would bias the jury, that it was a trick, that it undermined the jury's ability to assess officers' credibility based on his courtroom testimony. But Judge Harrison had made her decision. The motion is granted, she said firmly. But let me be clear, mister. If this demonstration doesn't show anything meaningful, it will likely have the opposite effect of what you're hoping for. The jury will see this as a desperate stunt, and it will reinforce their belief in officers' testimony. I understand, Your Honor, James said. As he left the judge's chambers and returned to the courtroom, James felt both elation and terror. He'd gotten what he wanted, but Torres was right about one thing. This was a huge gamble. If the demonstration didn't work, if Rex alerted on Sarah anyway, his credibility as a lawyer would be destroyed. Sarah's conviction would become almost certain. He'd essentially bet her entire case on a single, dramatic moment in a courtroom. That evening, James met with Sarah and to prepare for the demonstration, explained what they should expect. When a dog alerts without genuine cues from the handler, the behavior is usually different, he explained. A genuine alert involves specific, trained behaviors, but if the dog is confused about what it's supposed to be responding to, the behavior becomes inconsistent. The dog might approach your client out of curiosity instead of alerting. The dog might show conflicting signals, some alert behaviors mixed with friendly approach behaviors. What if the dog does alert? Sarah asked quietly, voicing the fear that James had been trying not to think about. Then we're finished, said honestly. If Rex alerts on Sarah without drugs present, we'll argue that the dog is reacting to residual sense or some other explanation. But the prosecution will argue that it proves the dog is reliable and will be worse off than before. Sarah nodded, absorbing this grim reality. I understand, she said, but I still want to do it because I know I'm innocent. And if there's any chance that's showing that will change the outcome, I have to take it. James looked at this woman, this teacher, this innocent person caught in the machinery of justice, and he felt the weight of responsibility almost crushing. He'd convinced her to take this risk. If it failed, he would have destroyed what little hope she had left. But it was the only option they had. In a justice system that seemed stacked against the innocent, sometimes you had to take desperate measures. You had to bet everything on a moment of truth, hope that honesty would shine through, and trust that a trained police dog, confronted with genuine innocence, would somehow reveal what the system couldn't see. The demonstration was scheduled for 3 days later. 3 days for James to prepare, to coordinate with, to work with Sarah to make sure she understood what they were attempting. 3 days to second-guess every decision and worry that he was leading his innocent client toward destruction. But there was no turning back now. The motion had been granted. The gambit had been set in motion. All that remained was to see if the truth would emerge, or if the machinery of injustice would continue its relentless forward motion. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Rex entered through the back door, officer holding his leash with practiced efficiency. The German Shepherd was magnificent. His coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His muscles rippled with each measured step. His alert dark eyes scanned the room with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The jury's attention locked onto the dog immediately. This was not an ordinary courtroom moment. This was theater drama, a break from the routine proceedings that had consumed the past 3 days of trial testimony. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes never leaving the animal. Sarah sat rigidly in the witness box, where Judge Harrison had instructed her to remain for the demonstration. She changed into a simple white blouse and dark slacks, nothing that might confuse a drug detection dog, though had assured her that Rex wouldn't smell drugs because there weren't any. Still, her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the witness box. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if the dog alerted anyway? What if had some way to trigger the alert? What if this entire gambit backfired spectacularly? James sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched tight as he watched Officer position himself with Rex in the center of the courtroom, roughly 20 feet from where Sarah sat. His face was carefully neutral, but James could see the tension in his shoulders. The officer hadn't been told exactly what would happen during the demonstration, only that he should bring Rex into the courtroom and follow the judge's instructions. Judge Harrison sat on the bench, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were sharp and attentive. This was highly irregular, and she would be watching every detail. "Officer," Judge Harrison began, "I want you to lead Rex toward the defendant, just as you would in a normal vehicle search. However, you will not signal to the dog in any way. I want you to be as neutral as possible in your demeanor and expectations. The court observer will be monitoring your body language. A court-appointed observer stood to the side, armed with a detailed checklist of behavioral cues: hand tension, breathing rate, shoulder positioning, eye movement, any micro-expressions that might telegraph expectations to the dog. It was an unusual arrangement, but Judge Harrison had insisted on it to maintain judicial oversight. Nodded, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He began to walk Rex towards Sarah, the leash held in his right hand. As they moved across the courtroom, James noticed something immediate. Shoulders had already begun to rise. His breathing seemed slightly elevated. The officer wasn't neutral, he was tense. And Rex, incredibly attuned to his handler, immediately responded by becoming more alert. The dog's ears perked up, his posture shifted from relaxed to engaged. Sarah's heart was hammering in her chest so hard she thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it. She wanted to close her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the dog. This was the moment. Everything depended on what happened in the next few seconds. Rex continued his approach, and his behavior began to shift into alert mode. His tail became more rigid. His sniffing became more pronounced and focused. His hand on the leash tightened. James could see it clearly, and he knew the court observer was documenting it. The jurors watched intently, their faces showing growing conviction that the dog was doing exactly what officer had it would do, detecting the presence of drugs. But then something extraordinary happened. Sarah took a deep breath, and in that moment of absolute clarity she locked eyes directly with Rex. Her fear crystallized into something else, a fierce, unshakable conviction. She spoke with a voice that filled the courtroom with quiet power. "I'm innocent." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. 2 simple words, 4 syllables, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt, no wavering, just pure, crystalline certainty. Rex stopped moving. The dog's entire body language shifted in an instant so dramatic that even the least observant juror could see it. His ears relaxed. His tail began to wag. The rigid alertness in his posture dissolved into something approaching curiosity and friendliness. Rex's head tilted slightly to the side, a gesture of canine confusion or interest. Instead of continuing his alert behaviors, the dog approached Sarah with a gentle, inquisitive manner. His nose came close to her, but not in the focused, intense way of a narcotics alert. Instead, it was the way a dog approached someone it found non-threatening, even pleasant. Officer's face went pale. His grip on the leash loosened visibly, and his body language, which had been tense, now showed confusion and concern. The tension in his shoulders evaporated. His breathing seemed to catch. The courtroom erupted. Whispers and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Several jurors' eyes widened. One woman's hand came to her mouth in shock. The prosecutor, Torres, stood up abruptly, her face flushed with alarm. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, watching Rex with an intensity that suggested she understood the implications of what she just witnessed. Sarah's voice trembled as she repeated, with the same absolute conviction, "I'm innocent." Rex's tail wagged again, and the dog actually pressed his body closer to Sarah in what could only be described as a friendly gesture. There was no alert. There was no triggered response. There was only a trained police dog reacting to a human being who was speaking a fundamental truth, and that truth had registered so clearly that it had whatever behavioral cues officer had been unconsciously sending. Judge Harrison banged her gavel once sharply. "Enough," she commanded. She turned to Officer. "Officer, please remove the dog from the courtroom." Looking shell-shocked, led a now-relaxed Rex away. The dog seemed completely uninterested in Sarah now, his earlier alert state behaviors completely abandoned. As he left the courtroom, his military bearing seemed to have collapsed. His face was ashen, his movements mechanical. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and troubled. She looked at the jury, and James could see understanding dawning on their faces. some confused, some shocked, some appearing to realize that something fundamental about the evidence they'd been presented had just been called into question. "We will recess for 1 hour," Judge Harrison announced. "Counsel will report to my chambers immediately." As the judge left the bench, James felt something shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The machinery of injustice that had been grinding forward so relentlessly seemed to have jammed. Sarah's 2 words, "I'm innocent," had done something that all of James's legal arguments and expert testimony couldn't have done on their own. They had created a moment of undeniable truth that a trained animal had responded to with perfect honesty. Sarah caught James's eye from the witness box, and he saw tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her innocence would be recognized. The dog had seen it. The judge had seen it. And now, perhaps, justice might actually prevail. The most powerful evidence in that courtroom hadn't been the drug baggie or the officer's testimony or the statistics about the dog's accuracy rate. The most powerful evidence had been the simple, undeniable truth spoken with absolute conviction by an innocent woman facing an animal trained to detect deception. And in that moment, everyone present understood that officer and his dog had not been detecting drugs at all. They had been responding to handler bias and expectation all along. The truth had finally emerged, spoken in just 2 words. Judge Harrison's chambers were austere and professional, lined with law books and framed certificates documenting her years of judicial service. Sarah sat in one of the leather chairs facing the judge's mahogany desk, while James stood beside her. The prosecutor, Torres, occupied another chair, her face a mixture of frustration and professional concern. The court observer, who had been monitoring body language during the demonstration, stood with a detailed report in hand. And there, sitting rigidly in the corner, was Officer, his military bearing now shattered, his face a mask of controlled panic. Judge Harrison set down the court observer's report with deliberate slowness. Her expression was grave, her voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of anger. "Officer, I have here a detailed analysis of your body language during the demonstration. According to this report, you exhibited 17 distinct behavioral cues that would signal expectations to a well-trained dog. These include hand tension on the leash, elevated breathing rate, shoulder elevation, and what the observer describes as microexpressions consistent with confirmation bias." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Care to explain?" His jaw clenched. "Your Honor, I was nervous about the courtroom setting. That's natural, it doesn't mean." "It means," Judge Harrison interrupted, "that your testimony about maintaining complete neutrality was inaccurate at best, and more importantly, it raises serious questions about whether Rex's alert in this case was based on actual drug detection or on your unconscious signaling to the dog." She turned to Torres. "Counsel, I'm going to recommend an immediate investigation into Officer's K-9 unit and all cases in which his alerts led to prosecution." Torres looked stricken. "Your Honor, with all due respect, one demonstration doesn't prove anything. The dog could have been." The dog's behavior changed dramatically when the defendant spoke words of absolute innocence, Judge Harrison said coldly. "A genuine narcotics detection dog does not change alert mode based on human speech. Doctor's testimony established that clearly. Officer's body language created the alert conditions. This case has revealed a serious problem that needs to be addressed immediately." Within hours of leaving the judge's chambers, the investigation had begun in earnest. Judge Harrison had contacted the Portland Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, requesting an immediate review of all cases involving Officer and Rex dating back 7 years. The department, suddenly aware that their credibility was at stake, moved with surprising speed. By the next morning, reporters were camped outside police headquarters. The story had exploded across local news. Police dog demonstration raises questions about evidence reliability. Within 24 hours, it had gone regional. Within 48 hours, it was national news. the image of Rex wagging his tail and approaching Sarah with friendly curiosity, while Officer's face went pale, had been captured by courtroom cameras and was being replayed on every news channel in America. Sarah sat in James's office as they watched the news coverage together. She felt numb, disconnected from the reality that her case had become a national scandal. James's phone rang constantly with calls from other attorneys, law professors, and civil rights organizations asking if they could help. "We need to focus on the investigation," James said, his voice carrying a new confidence that Sarah hadn't heard before. "Whatever happens with your case is now secondary to exposing how widespread this problem might be." The investigation revealed things even James hadn't anticipated. Internal Affairs began reviewing every case where Officer and Rex had been involved in narcotics arrests. They requested video footage from the vehicles, body camera recordings from the officers, and documentation of how evidence had been handled. What they found was shocking. In 37 of the 143 cases reviewed, no actual drugs were discovered despite positive alerts. This revelation alone was staggering, a failure rate of over 25%, far higher than had. But it got worse. In 14 of those cases where no drugs were found, charges had still been filed based on testimony that he knew drugs were present even if they weren't recovered. 9 innocent people had pleaded guilty despite having no actual drugs on their persons or in their vehicles, terrified of harsher sentences if they went to trial and lost. 5 additional innocent people had been convicted based solely on testimony and Rex's alert, even though no contraband was ever recovered. The investigation also uncovered something more sinister. In 2019, a complaint had been filed against by a defendant who claimed to have been wrongly searched. That case had been quietly settled by the city for an undisclosed amount. The settlement agreement had included a non-disclosure clause that prevented the defendant from talking about the case. 4 other similar settlements were discovered, each containing non-disclosure agreements, each quietly burying accusations of improper conduct. Federal prosecutors became involved. They began examining whether Officer had engaged in a pattern of evidence planting. Video footage of during searches was analyzed frame by frame. In 17 separate cases, investigators found moments where appeared to place something in a vehicle that he then discovered during his search. The evidence wasn't always conclusive. Sometimes the angle made it impossible to see exactly what happened, but the pattern was undeniable to trained investigators. Officer was arrested and charged with 14 counts of evidence tampering, 8 counts of perjury, and 2 counts of conspiracy. Bail was set at $1 million, which he was unable to post. He remained in custody as the investigation expanded. The media coverage became relentless. Activists appeared at police headquarters demanding reform. Legal experts discussed K-9 reliability on television programs. The case against Sarah was dissolved entirely within a week, and she walked out of the courthouse to a crowd of reporters and supporters. But she barely heard their questions. Her mind was on the 14 other people whose lives had been destroyed by Officer's corruption. James organized a meeting with several of those individuals. There was a construction worker who had served 3 years of a 5-year sentence before being released when his case was reviewed. There was Jennifer, who had lost custody of her children because of a drug conviction based on alert, even though she'd never used drugs. There was Robert, who had spent 4 years in prison for a crime that never happened. Each of them had a story of devastation, of lives shattered by one corrupt officer, and a dog that had been trained to respond to his unconscious cues rather than to actual evidence. Sarah found herself at the center of something much larger than her own case. Her 2 words, "I'm innocent," had not only freed her, but had opened a door that exposed years of systematic corruption. Her conviction had resonated through the justice system like a tuning fork, revealing all the places where the system had failed. The National Association for Criminal Justice Reform cited her case in their arguments for sweeping changes to K-9 evidence standards. Several states began requiring video evidence and corroborating proof before allowing K-9 alerts to justify arrests. Portland's police department implemented new protocols for K-9 handlers, including mandatory body camera recording during all drug searches and regular independent audits of alert accuracy rates. Judge Harrison began working with law schools and judicial organizations to develop training programs for judges to recognize handler bias and question testimony that relied too heavily on K-9 alerts. Her chamber had become ground zero for a quiet revolution in how the legal system treated police dog evidence. And at the center of it all was Sarah Mitchell, a teacher who had refused to accept injustice, who had spoken two words with absolute conviction, and who had somehow managed to crack open a system that had seemed impervious to reform. Her case was no longer just about her. It had become about all the innocent people who had been failed by a system that trusted authority too easily and questioned it too rarely. The machinery of injustice had finally stopped grinding, and in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. Sarah Mitchell stood in the Portland Elementary School gymnasium, looking at the banner that hung across the bleachers. "Welcome back, Ms. Mitchell." Beneath it, a sea of young faces looked up at her with expressions of confusion, excitement, and curiosity. Some of these children were the same fourth graders she'd taught before her arrest. They'd grown noticeably in the months she'd been gone, their faces slightly more mature, their eyes carrying questions about where their teacher had disappeared to and why she was returning now. Principal Davis stood beside her, his expression carefully neutral. He'd called her 2 weeks ago to offer her reinstatement, along with a formal apology from the school district and a settlement check that was meant to compensate her for lost wages and emotional distress. The district had been eager to make peace. Sarah's vindication had made her something of a celebrity in the education community, and schools wanted to distance themselves from the appearance of having wronged her. She'd accepted the settlement and the apology, but what she really wanted was simply to return to teaching. "Welcome back, Ms. Mitchell," Principal Davis said warmly, as if she'd never been gone. He gestured to the assembled students and staff. "These children have missed you." As Sarah walked to the center of the gymnasium, the cheers from the students washed over her. Tears filled her eyes. She'd spent so many months believing she'd never teach again, that her career had been permanently destroyed. Now, standing before these children, she felt something she'd thought was gone forever: hope. But the return to Lincoln Elementary was only the beginning of Sarah's new life. Within weeks of her exoneration, she began receiving invitations to speak at legal conferences, law schools, and criminal justice reform organizations. Universities wanted her perspective on police accountability. Lawmakers wanted her testimony as they drafted new legislation about K-9 evidence standards. Civil rights organizations wanted her to be the face of a new movement. At first, Sarah was hesitant. She'd never been comfortable with public attention. She was a teacher, a quiet person who preferred books and her students to reporters and cameras. But James had encouraged her to consider the broader implications of her case. "You have a platform now," he'd told her. "You can use it to help people who are still trapped in the system that nearly destroyed you." So Sarah began speaking. She spoke at the National Association for Criminal Justice Reform's annual conference, where she detailed her experience and discussed the research on K-9 reliability. She before the Oregon State Legislature about the need for reformed K-9 protocols. She gave interviews to major news outlets about systemic bias in the criminal justice system. And with each appearance, more people listened. More victims came forward. More cases were reviewed. The number of wrongful convictions overturned in cases involving officer climbed steadily. By the end of the first year following the courtroom demonstration, 14 innocent people had been released from prison or exonerated. By the end of the second year, that number had grown to 23 as additional cases were uncovered and reviewed. Families were reunited. Lives were rebuilt. Sarah received letters from several of those exonerated individuals. Sent her a photo of himself with his family, smiling broadly, finally able to move on with his life. Jennifer wrote about regaining custody of her children and how they were slowly learning to trust again after years of separation. Robert sent a handwritten note thanking her for fighting for people she didn't even know, for speaking truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. These letters became the anchor that kept Sarah connected to the human reality of the reform work she was doing. It would have been easy to become caught up in the legal and political aspects of the movement, the legislation, the statistics, the policy changes. But the letters reminded her that behind every statistic was a real person, a real family, a real life that had been devastated and then, because of her 2 words spoken in a courtroom, had been given a second chance. James' legal practice transformed alongside Sarah's transformation. He became known as an expert in police accountability cases and K-9 evidence challenges. He took on cases without charge, for people he believed had been wrongly convicted based on police dog alerts. His small practice expanded as other attorneys joined him, forming a small firm dedicated to criminal justice reform. He was invited to teach at Portland State University's law school, where he developed a seminar on police dog evidence and handler bias, specifically based on Sarah's case. Judge Harrison became an unlikely champion of reform within the judicial system. She began writing papers on judicial recognition of cognitive bias in police testimony. She spoke at judicial conferences across the country about the importance of questioning authority figures and recognizing the ways that unconscious bias could corrupt even well-trained animals and dedicated officers. She became instrumental in establishing new standards for admitting K-9 evidence in courts nationwide. Her decisions in Sarah's case became precedent-setting, cited in briefs and arguments in courtrooms across America. 2 years after Sarah's exoneration, the American Bar Association issued new guidelines for the admissibility of K-9 evidence in criminal cases. The guidelines recommended that K-9 alerts alone should not be sufficient probable cause for a search or arrest. They recommended video documentation of all K-9 searches. They recommended regular independent audits of handler accuracy rates. They recommended that handlers be required to maintain rigorous neutrality during searches, with body cameras running at all times. The guidelines were based substantially on the research that James had discovered and the real-world evidence from Sarah's case. By the 3rd year after her exoneration, Sarah had made a significant career shift. She continued teaching part-time at Lincoln Elementary, maintaining her commitment to her students. But she also began working with a nonprofit organization dedicated to criminal justice reform, specifically focusing on police accountability and systemic bias in the legal system. She traveled frequently, speaking at law schools and judicial training programs. She worked with incarcerated individuals who believed they'd been wrongly convicted, helping them understand their legal options and connect with attorneys who might be able to help them. The most rewarding moment came when Sarah returned to the courthouse where her trial had taken place. She was testifying before a judicial ethics committee about the importance of recognizing handler bias in police testimony. As she sat in the witness chair, not as a defendant this time, but as an expert, she saw Judge Harrison in the gallery, watching her testimony with pride. When Sarah finished speaking, Judge Harrison approached her afterward. "You've changed the system," Judge Harrison said simply. "Not just for you, but for everyone. What you did, speaking those 2 words with absolute conviction, that's what broke through the noise. That's what made everyone see the truth." Sarah nodded, emotion overwhelming her. "I just said what I knew to be true," she replied quietly. "I'm innocent. Those weren't brave words. They were just honest words." But they had been brave, and they had been powerful. 2 simple words, spoken in a courtroom by a woman who'd been stripped of everything, had created a ripple that transformed the entire system. Officer was serving an 8-year sentence for evidence tampering and perjury. The K-9 unit in Portland had been completely restructured with new protocols and oversight. Training programs nationwide had been updated to account for handler bias. And most importantly, innocent people were walking free, people who might otherwise have spent decades in prison for crimes they never committed. Sarah continued her work for years, watching as the movement she'd helped start expanded far beyond what she could have imagined. Other cases of police misconduct began to be questioned, and other innocent people were exonerated. The system, while far from perfect, had begun to change in meaningful ways. On quiet evenings in her apartment, Sarah would sometimes think back to that day, the broken taillight, the traffic stop, the planted drugs, the arrest. It had been the worst day of her life and the beginning of a journey she never anticipated. But that journey had led her to a purpose she'd never expected to find. She'd been given a second chance at her life, and she'd used that chance to help others find theirs. And it had all begun with two words: "I'm innocent." Those words had become a testament to the power of truth spoken with absolute conviction. In a system designed by humans and often vulnerable to human bias and corruption, sometimes all it took was an honest voice, and a trained animal's honest response to reveal what needed to be seen. Sarah Mitchell's case had become legendary, not as a story of individual vindication, but as proof that speaking truth, no matter how powerless you feel, can still change the world.